Talking about our respiratory system, moving on into a new system where we will discuss breathing and moving oxygen and CO2 throughout our body to provide our oxygen to our working tissues and to remove the CO2 from those working tissues. Many structures, but not a huge amount of structures, make up our respiratory system. Includes some different air passages, like the larynx and the trachea, the pharynx, which is actually a shared tube of both the respiratory and digestive systems. Digestive carrying food and drink into your esophagus. For the respiratory system, it carries air from your nose and mouth to the larynx. And then within our lungs, we have a bunch of structures called bronchial, or that make up our bronchial tree. Primary bronchi, secondary, all the way down to the very tips where we find these little structures called alveoli. Those are enclosed within our spongy-like organs called the lungs, which we don't really specifically talk too much about the lungs themselves, but instead the stuff that's inside of them. As far as what our respiratory system does, it contributes to homeostasis kind of here with three different things. Really, I should say more because this last bullet has 3 or 4 things listed. Probably the most important, prominent function of our respiratory system is to provide for the exchange of gases, oxygen and carbon dioxide, between the atmospheric air, that'd be the air that we are breathing in the atmosphere around us. Exchanging it with our blood, bringing that oxygen into our blood, CO2 out, and then breathing it out. And then actually exchanging it in our tissues, like in our muscles and in our brain and different things like that. And as we just learned and talked about in our previous lecture, by breathing off CO2, we also help regulate pH. We mentioned this at the very beginning of the semester when we first introduced the concept of pH and acidosis. We learned there were 2 major systems involved with regulating pH, the respiratory system being the first. We haven't talked about the other. You guys remember what it was? The urinary system. And by peeing out urine, we also regulate long-term acid-base balance. So we'll kind of talk a little bit about acid-base balance here in this lecture, but we'll pick up more with that in our last unit, second last lecture of the semester here in a couple of weeks. And then finally, the last bullet there is kind of just some accessory functions or secondary functions of our respiratory system. It contains receptors for the sense of smell, which we've talked about before, obviously within our nose. Filtering inspired air, which really related back to what we talked about with our lymph and immune lecture. Production of vocal sounds, which we really don't even get into at all in this class. And then the excretion of small amounts of water and heat, which is pretty negligible, so we don't really talk too much about that. But we do excrete water and heat by breathing. All right, let's talk about the structures of our respiratory system. A little bit of anatomy here. Talking about, parts and structures so that, we can understand and learn a little bit about function as they go hand in hand. We've talked about anatomy with just about every lecture. Our respiratory system and those different structures that were labeled there on that first page can be divided kind of 2 different ways. Structurally and then functionally. Structurally, we just break them down into an upper respiratory tract and a lower respiratory tract. The upper respiratory tract includes the nose. Really, I should include the mouth because we breathe through the mouth as well. And then the divisions of the pharynx, there's 3 different divisions. The naso, oro, and laryngeal pharynx, which we really don't care too much about in this class. The lower respiratory tract or lower respiratory system includes everything below the pharynx, the larynx, which is also known as your voice box, the trachea, all segments of our bronchial tree within the lungs, and then the lungs themselves. Kind of more importantly to us, because we're always more focused on functionality, will be the way that we divide the respiratory system functionally into what we call a conducting zone and a respiratory zone. The conducting zone is just going to conduct air into the lungs. First filters, warms, and moistens it, especially in places like our nose, where we've got the mucus and those folds of bone called the nasal concave. But our conducting zone has nothing to do with exchanging of gases. It runs from our nose all the way to what we call terminal bronchioles. More physiologically important, and what we'll kind of focus on more in this class, is the respiratory zone, where gas exchange takes place. And we'll be talking mainly about these structures called alveoli, which I always compare to like grapes, okay? Because they are little ball-like structures like a grape. And actually here on the next page, we've got a picture showing you several alveoli. Like a grape, you don't grow them independently. They are in clumps or clusters. A cluster of alveoli is what an alveolar sac is. Little airways that feed those alveoli are called alveolar ducts, and they grow at the tip of what we call our respiratory bronchioles, the very tip of our bronchial tree. So it's like grapes grow on vines, but we can pretend that grapes grow on the very tippy top, very tiniest branches of a tree. And in this case, we've got millions of them growing at the tippy tops and itty bitty branches of our bronchial tree inside our lungs. Now, our lungs themselves are located in our thoracic cavity, which is the cavity that also consists of the heart, large blood vessels, trachea, esophagus, and thymus. I don't even really know why I include that. But our lungs are kind of confusing to learn for students. Not like an empty balloon. They're more like a sponge. And actually, if we were to dissect one, you would be able to feel how spongy it is. It's really kind of cool. Inside of our lungs are these millions upon millions of alveoli, but surrounding them are two wet epithelial membranes that affect the ability of our lungs to expand and inflate and then deflate in order to allow us to breathe in and out. The two membranes are what we call a parietal pleura and a visceral pleura. The parietal pleura is a thin superficial membrane that lines the thoracic cavity, and a visceral pleura covers each lung. Okay. The importance is these membranes have a very tiny, and it's described as a potential space between the two, called an intrapleural space, where there's actually really not much between them. It's full of a fluid called pleural fluid that produces surface tension, causing the two membranes to stick together. So I always kind of think of it like when you see in kids' movies and cartoons, like when you glue your hands together, and they get stuck. If you try to pull them apart, they pull back together. And these membranes are like that they're stuck together, which is important because this is going to influence how our lungs fill up with air and deflate, pushing air out. Okay. Now, the pleural fluid that's also in there helps reduce friction so that those membranes aren't, rubbing on each other and, creating holes and that kind of stuff between them. You've probably heard watching movies and TV shows about a person having like a collapsed lung. A collapsed lung results when these two membranes are no longer stuck together. And then the membranes are separated from one another, and there's air in that space. That's called a pneumothorax. Happens like if you get a punctured lung, like, you get stabbed or something like that. Very drastic, but also very, very dangerous because it's going to be very, very difficult to breathe, especially if you have two collapsed lungs. You are in very, very, very rough shape. Now, breathing is just one of the many aspects of respiration that we're going to talk about. Respiration is a fancy way to describe the process of gas exchange in our body, and hence why we call this system the respiratory system. Begins with breathing that I've been talking about, what we call pulmonary ventilation, where air flows into and out of the lungs. Air moving into the lungs is called inspiration or inhalation, whereas movement of air out of the lungs is referred to as expiration or exhalation. You've probably heard those terms, and that's not brand new information to you, nor is the fact that inspiration allows O2 to enter the lungs and expiration permits CO2 to leave the lungs. But just getting the O2 into the lungs is a small step along the way. The second step takes place with those alveoli and what we call our pulmonary capillaries, which we kind of introduce a little bit in our lecture on the heart. This illustration doesn't really do it justice, but each of these little alveoli for plural, is surrounded very, very densely by pulmonary capillaries, which are where the blood flows to deliver the CO2 to the alveoli to get it out and O2 to be picked up, as we show here. What I just described was what we call pulmonary gas exchange or external/pulmonary respiration, where gases are exchanged between the alveoli, air sacs of the lungs, and the blood in the pulmonary capillaries. In this step, the pulmonary capillary blood gains O2 and it loses CO2. Now, in our last lectures, we talked a lot about the heart and blood vessels and transporting oxygen and carbon dioxide either to and from our tissues. And that's what we're going to be talking more about here in this lecture. Step 3 is the transport of O2 and CO2 by our blood. O2 to the tissues from our lungs, where we can then unload it to the cells, to the tissues. CO2 can be picked up by our blood from the tissues and then be transported back to the lungs to be exhaled out. To help with this, our blood has various chemicals, one of which we talked quite a bit about in our blood lecture, hemoglobin, but it is not the only thing that allows for the transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide, as we'll find out later in the lecture. Once we get to the tissues, we perform systemic gas exchange, which is essentially the exact opposite of pulmonary gas exchange, where we exchange O2 and CO2. This time O2 leaves the blood to go to our systemic cells, and CO2 gets picked up by our tissue or by our blood from our tissue cells. Another term for this is internal respiration or tissue respiration. And it sets the stage for our fifth and final step, what we call cellular respiration, which is really the whole reason why we breathe, to take O2 and nutrients and produce ATP, while at the same time producing carbon dioxide that we end up breathing off. Cellular respiration, we've learned just a little bit about this semester, can be anaerobic or aerobic, which means either without or with oxygen. In this case, we would call this aerobic cell respiration, which is because we're using oxygen. This is the process where we go through glycolysis in the Krebs cycle and the transition reaction, which takes actually place before the Krebs cycle, and the electron transport chain, ultimately forming ATP to power all those different things like muscle contractions and whatnot we've talked about this semester. This will be the very last thing we talk about in Unit 6, where we dive into and learn more about them. Probably, I would say, the least liked or most hated, probably would be a better way to describe it, lecture of the semester. For whatever reason, students hate it. I get it, because it's a lot of biochemistry mumbo jumbo. But it's very important. And I put it after we talk about breathing and eating, respiratory system, digestive system. because oxygen and food are the ingredients for it, because we use glucose and fats and amino acids from proteins to perform this, along with that oxygen that we breathe in. So I set the stage by giving out and learning about the inputs before we can learn about the outputs. We'll get to that, though. We're not ready. That'll be here in about 2 weeks. Maybe next Thursday we'll get to it. Part of it anyway. Okay, so what that means is we're going to kind of talk about 4 of these 5 things. Okay. I'm going to start and learn more about pulmonary ventilation, technical term for breathing, which consists of a repetitive cycle of inspiration and expiration, breathing in, breathing out. This constant alteration between inspiration and expiration is called a respiratory cycle, where air moves in and out of the lungs in the same manner that blood circulates, which is due to a pressure gradient. Okay. Now, since well, I guess we got time. It's a little more late. I was thinking this one. Let's go ahead and finish this, and then we'll see where we're at. So, looking back or thinking back to our lecture on the heart and blood vessels, which is, a nice thing, because you're going to have to be learning this, or should already know it, but definitely will need to know it by next Tuesday. We learned that blood flow is a result of pressure gradient going from high pressure to low pressure. The same law, or the same effect, is going to affect the flow of air in and out of our lungs, except with our lungs, which are a closed container, like this jar with a piston on top closing it off. A closed container kind of puts another wrench in the system. Okay. Let's call this, or let's talk about, and we're going to see several laws in this lecture. The first is Boyle's law, which states that there's an inverse relationship between the volume and the pressure inside a closed container, which can be illustrated here or here if we're talking about the lungs. Once again, an inverse relationship tells you that if one is up, the other one is down. One is high, one is low. Okay. Whereas like right here with our piston in the elevated position, the space inside the jar is pretty good, right? Pretty good inside 1 liter, in fact, is our volume, the amount of space. Pressure is at 1, what we call ATM, atmosphere. Not that I'm going to ask you to really know that, because we'll deal more with millimeters of mercury like we do with blood pressure. But by pushing down on that piston, we have now decreased the volume inside of that closed container to 1/2 liter. But look what's happened to pressure. Volume goes down, pressure goes up. This is the principle that relates to how we breathe. And it relates to 2 pressures. Pressure outside our body, pressure in the atmosphere, what we call P sub B. P for pressure, B for barometric. And P sub A, which represents pressure inside our alveoli. When we breathe in, it's because pressure in the atmosphere is higher than pressure in our lungs. Whereas when we breathe out, its pressure is higher in our lungs than it is outside our body. How does it work? Look at the size of the lungs here versus over here. You guys see a difference? Here, the volume of the lungs is bigger. And what did we say? Volume goes up, pressure goes down because it's an inverse relationship. Whereas here, the lungs are smaller, like our jar over here. Volume is lower, pressure goes up. Now you might be wondering, how do we change the volume of the lungs to change the pressure in our lungs? Well, it goes back to those two membranes I was talking about earlier. What we call the parietal and the visceral pleura that like to stick to one another. Well, the parietal pleura essentially is affected on by the diaphragm, that major muscle of breathing. Diaphragm is a muscle that will contract and pull down, pulling on the parietal pleura, and since the visceral pleura likes to stick to that parietal pleura, guess what happens? The visceral pleura goes with it, and your visceral pleura is attached to your lungs. So when your diaphragm contracts, you're essentially expanding and increasing the volume of your lungs. And as I just said, if volume goes up, pressure goes down. Inverse relationship. So pressure in the lungs decreases because of changes in that interpleural pressure. Pressure in the intrapleural space. During our respiratory cycle, several mechanisms are used to change the size of the thoracic cavity, which in turn changes the interpleural pressure, which changes alveolar pressure. If you decrease volume of the thoracic cavity, meaning this space goes down, pressure goes up in that interpleural space, and that's what causes us to exhale. Whereas an increase in volume, pressure goes down in the intrapleural space and in the lungs, resulting in inhalation. So what I've kind of done is just shown you here with the three things involved resulting in airflow. So let's say thoracic cavity dimensions go down. So if the dimensions go down, volume goes down. Volume goes down, what happens to the pressure in our intrapleural space? It's an inverse relationship, so it goes up, which causes alveolar pressure to go up, which establishes a pressure gradient. What direction is air going to flow, in or out of the lungs? So this is, our lungs are small, our pressure's up. We showed it on the previous page that that's going to cause us to expire. Okay, that's what makes us breathe out. Now, if thoracic cavity dimensions increase, our lungs get bigger. Pressure goes down in the intrapleural space, inside the lungs as well. Pressure gradient is established, this time causing air to flow in. So how do we do that? Well, let's talk about it now. Breathing in is called inhalation or inspiration. We've mentioned that several times. We've also said for it to occur, air pressure in our lungs must decrease, which is accomplished by expanding the lungs to increase their volume. The most important muscle of inhalation is that diaphragm, a dome-shaped skeletal muscle that forms the floor of the thoracic cavity, which when it contracts, it goes from kind of a dome shape to a more flattened shape. And it pulls the pleura along with it, making the volume of the lungs increase. Volume increases, pressure decreases. Now, since we're contracting a muscle, we would say that inhalation is an active process. Now, here in a second, we're going to talk about exhalation, and we'll learn that it's a passive process. Our diaphragm is our major muscle used during what we call quiet inspiration, which is a fancy way to describe resting breathing, when you're not breathing heavily and rapidly, like you guys are all exhibiting right now. But if I told you to huff and puff and blow a house down, breathe faster, breathe deeper, you're going to end up recruiting other muscles like your external intercostals, muscle between your ribs that pull the ribs up, enlarging the thoracic cavity from front to back and side to side. So take a deep breath in. You're recruiting your external intercostal muscles. Okay. That's what forced inspiration is. Along with the muscles of your scalene, spec minor, and sternocleidomastoid, which are all kind of upper chest and into your neck muscles. We take very, very deep breaths. Forced inspiration is that process. As our thoracic cavity enlarges, it pulls along with it because the cohesion between the parietal and pleural membranes. Remember, they're like gluing your hands together. They stick together, causing our lungs to expand, and pressure in our bronchial tree decreases. Our ability of our lungs and thorax to stretch is called compliance. Compliance is just a fancy word for the ability of our lungs to stretch like a rubber band. And our lungs normally have high compliance. If you go to the drugstore or Dollar General or whatever and you buy a pack of rubber bands, sometimes you can get them in like a variety pack where you've got like the skinny rubber bands and the thick rubber bands, right? Everybody's seen and stretched out a skinny rubber band versus a thick rubber band, right? Which one's easier to pull on and stretch? The skinny one, right? The thicker the rubber band, like these that I'm wearing on my wrist, the harder they are to pull. We want our lungs to not be like a thick rubber band. We don't want them to struggle to stretch. Normal healthy lungs are really, really nice and stretchy. They have high compliance, which relates to two principal factors: elasticity and surface tension. We know what elasticity is. We've talked about that with several different tissues, especially muscle, for example. We've talked all about how muscles have the ability to stretch. Elasticity is something we need our lungs to have, and they typically have a lot of elasticity because of the elastic fibers in them and are easily stretched. Surface tension is something that we haven't really talked much about, but it affects compliance. Thankfully, we have a chemical that we produce in our lungs called surfactant that reduces surface tension. Now, I said a normal healthy lung has high compliance, but we all know that not everybody has normal healthy lungs, especially people that choose to smoke, right? Which causes the lungs to be more like that thick rubber band, and it's harder to expand them. So decreased compliance is a common feature in pulmonary conditions that you scar your lung tissues, cause lung tissue to become filled with fluid, what we call pulmonary edema. So it's harder for them to expand because there's fluid in there, to produce a deficiency in surfactant, or impede our lung expansion anyway, like paralysis of those intercostal muscles. So people with decreased lung compliance are going to have a really hard time taking a very deep, full breath because their lungs don't stretch like a rubber band, skinny rubber band. Okay. Now, people that have emphysema, on the other hand, which is something that a lot of people have when they smoke for years and years and years, actually have too much compliance. They don't have the ability to recoil. So what people with emphysema have is like what happens to a waistband after it's been stretched and stretched and stretched. What happens to a waistband in that situation? it loses the ability to snap back, right? And that's a component that affects exhalation. Exhalation or expiration occurs when we just reverse all those pressure gradients involved with breathing in, we just reverse them. So in other words, our pressure in the lungs must now be greater than pressure in the atmosphere. Unlike quiet inspiration, which was an active process, quiet expiration, taking a normal exhale out, is a passive process. And that's because it's just relaxing those muscles, especially that diaphragm that we contracted. We just relax it, bring it back. And relaxing is a passive process. Now, if you take a deep breath in and you blow really, really, really hard, forced expiration, you're going to recruit other muscles like your internal intercostals as well as your ab muscles, which can cause increases in pressure up to 20 millimeters of mercury, more than what you saw earlier with quiet expiration. But for both quiet expiration and forced expiration, this is all dependent upon your lungs' ability to recoil or snap back, as I always say, unlike that waistband that gets really stretched out. Anybody ever been around somebody with emphysema before? Person with emphysema, one of the telltale signs, aside from obviously they can't breathe very well, is they have a big barreled chest, is what they describe it as. It looks like they're just like puffing their chest out like they're, some tough guy. It's because their lungs are overinflated all the time. They can't deflate their lungs because their lungs lose that elasticity. They can't return to their initial size. Okay. Does that make sense? So here is just an illustration showing you the cycle of events taking place as a person breathes in and out. Starting here, rest between breaths. So after a normal exhale, we notice alveolar pressure is 760 millimeters of mercury. Pressure in the atmosphere is also 760 millimeters of mercury. So flow of air is neither in or out, it's between breaths. And that's where the diaphragm's in an elevated position, but then it contracts, pulls on that set of membranes, causing the volume in the lungs to go with it, or the volume to go up. Because the lungs go with it, pressure drops in our lungs. Doesn't have to be a lot, but 760 is greater than 758. Everybody agree with me? So a pressure gradient is established, drawing air into the lungs. When our diaphragm returns to its resting state in that dome shape, volume goes down in our lungs and pressure goes up. 762 is greater than 760, so now the pressure gradient is established to push the air out and into the atmosphere. And then we can start it all over, and we do this about 12 times a minute at rest. Okay, this is a nice spot to stop and pick up with on Thursday. So we will take a time out here.